In this video, we're going to look at how to use your voice effectively in presentations to help you communicate clearly and also engage your audience. We're going to look at 4 things: projection, pace, intonation, and pronunciation. So first of all, projection. We all know that it's important that our audience can hear us. And yet I'm sure we've also all had times when we've watched somebody else's presentation that has been too quiet or maybe even too loud. So the key thing really is practicing if possible, and getting feedback from a friend, particularly if you can, practicing in a particular room that you're going to be using. A common area that trips people up is unconsciously not talking facing the audience, but turning and actually presenting at the slides. So your voice just isn't traveling in the right direction. At the moment or another time, if you're having to prepare a presentation recording, the volume's also important on that. And so practicing and doing some trial ones just to try and get a good sound quality would be worthwhile. If you're having real difficulties making recordings and getting the sound quality good enough, then it would be a really good idea to get in touch with your tutor or supervisor as soon as possible. So now we're going to look at pace. Pace is a really important part of presenting. If you have a look at this paragraph, you probably find it quite uncomfortable to read. With effort, I'm sure you can read it and work out what the different words are, but it puts a lot of strain on you as the reader. It's the same when you're speaking. If you speak without any pausing or if you speak too quickly. So although most often people can worry about hesitating or pausing because they don't want to sound like they don't know what they're talking about, or they want to sound really prepared, actually pauses could be really, really important. They are like the punctuation, the full stops, the commas, or the paragraphs that we use in our writing to break things up, to help communicate clearly. Okay, so here we have again that paragraph that we had on the previous slide. I'm going to read it first of all without any pausing so you can see what that sounds like. Let's look at cells in a little more detail. Cells vary in size. This is for 3 reasons. Firstly, hills, valleys and buildings can interfere with signal transition and therefore antennae are placed so that disruption to the signal coverage is minimised. Secondly, the size of the cells depends on the frequency used. The higher the frequency, the larger the cell tends to be. This just being read like that is just really a hit of information that sounds quite boring, quite dense, and it's just really hard for the listener to kind of process and digest what is being said. It needs to be broken up more. However, where you pause is important, and if we pause in the wrong place, it can sound hesitant and jerky. So listen again. Let's look at the cells in a little more detail. Cells vary in size. This is for 3 reasons. First, hills, valleys and buildings can interfere with signal transition and therefore antennae are placed so that disruption to signal coverage is minimised. Secondly, the size of the cell depends on the frequency used. The higher the frequency, the larger the cell tends to be. Pausing in the wrong place is really uncomfortable and just distracts the person listening and makes it harder to understand. So finally, that effective pausing that acts like punctuation. To decide where to pause, it can actually be really useful to think of the punctuation that you have in writing. And also, the punctuation in the writing can serve as a good guide to the size of pause you have as well, recognising that, almost like a full stop is a bigger break than a comma is a shorter one. The length of our pauses varies. You may, however, have slightly more pausing in your speech than you would have in your writing, and this is fine, but thinking about where are the phrases that need to be grouped together and not broken up. So here's this one read again. Let's look at cells in a little more detail. Cells vary in size. This is for 3 reasons. Firstly, hills, valleys and buildings can interfere with signal transition, and therefore antennae are placed so that the disruption to signal coverage is minimised. Secondly, the size of the cells depends on the frequency used. The higher the frequency, the larger the cell tends to be. Okay, as well as pace, our intonation is really important. If we speak at the same tone throughout, it sounds monotonous, it's very same. That can make it hard to concentrate, and it can also be quite boring. And it kind of gives that message that you're bored, and if you sound bored about your research, you're not going to make somebody else enthusiastic. So that intonation, the rise and fall of our speech, is really important. Typically, we would expect us to start a little higher at a sentence or a phrase and then to drop throughout, kind of at the end of the idea. If you've got a list, you'd expect the tone to keep rising throughout that list until the last item, where you'd then expect it to fall. As well as the tone, the stress that we put on words is really important. In academic writing, we don't use contractions. So contractions are where you shorten some words, like let's instead of let us, there are instead of there are. The contractions wouldn't be used in academic writing, but they're a really important part of academic speaking. By contracting some words and then stressing other words, we help the listener to pick out which parts are more important. In addition to the contractions, often certain words may be weaker and not stressed as much, and that can affect how they sound. For example, if I read the sentence, let's look at cells in a little more detail. Words like at, in, I didn't stress them, so it changed the way they sound. Let's look at. The at, it makes an ut sound. Look at. You almost miss the word. You don't need to try and copy this pronunciation. You might help to be aware of it. But I would try to check that you are using the contracted forms where appropriate, because this does just help the flow of the sentence in your speaking. So I said about that stressing of the key words and to making sure that the sounds are even clearer, maybe slightly louder, slightly longer. So in this sentence, cells would be the key word, because that's kind of the new or different idea, a particularly important idea. And so we might read that something like this. Let's look at cells in a little more detail. Okay, some students really worry about their pronunciation. Obviously, you don't need to speak like the Queen, but it is important that you can be understood clearly. Something that would benefit most speakers is consciously thinking about moving your mouth more to help you articulate your speech. When we think about moving our mouth, it makes the sounds come out more clearly, rather than when our mouths are quite rigid and not moving very much, it just can sound like we're mumbling and make it harder to understand. It can also be useful to reflect on, are there certain sounds people find harder to understand in your speech? Are there certain words that they find harder to understand? And in particular, what are the key words that you really need people to understand, that you're going to be saying again and again and again, and are those clear? If there's a particular word that when you get to it, you're always tripping up, or you can see people don't understand, it's worth thinking, do you really need that word, or is there a synonym? So we've been looking at the importance of how to use your voice effectively, thinking about pace and projection, intonation and pronunciation. So we're thinking about asking yourself, are you easy to listen to in terms of your volume and speed? And in particular at the moment, if you're recording a presentation for an assessment, watch out if you're using a script that you're not just reading and sounding flat or reading without pausing. Make sure that you have still got those natural flow, like gaps and markers that are planned in there that just help break it up for the reader. Think about, do you sound excited about your own research? Does your voice project excitement? And are you using pausing effectively? I'd really recommend watching some of the winners from the 3 minute thesis competition. 3 minute thesis, as the name suggests, is where you have PhD students in 3 minutes presenting their research. I've put a couple of examples here, and I would highly recommend listening to them to see how they use pausing, how they use their voice to the rise and the fall, how they stress certain words to engage the audience and communicate clearly.